Уважаемые участники,
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Responsible Futures online forum organized by the UK Embassy's section on culture and education jointly with the climate section of the UK Embassy. This forum is part of a large-scale University Alliance program, which is aimed at establishing dialogue between the UK and Russian colleges. This forum is going to be held in two languages, namely Russian and English, and simultaneous interpretation is available. Please make sure you have selected the relevant language. To do this, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and select either English or Russian, whichever. It's it's a must to use the Zoom app rather than the web version, because otherwise you won't be able to use the simultaneous interpretation function.
button.
If you have any questions, please submit them to our speakers through the Q&A section, and we'll try to take all of your questions on air. At the end of the forum, we will send you a hyperlink to a feedback form. It's a really short one, but your feedback is important for us. So please answer a couple of questions on the forum that will help us improve the upcoming forums. Today's topic is, basically the title of the session is Economic Forecasting and Governance Policies for Sustainable Development. And we have invited a number of pundits and very valuable experts to take part in the session. We have about 2.5 hours to discuss all of these relevant issues. We don't want to waste any more of your time, so I'm not going to be offering any opening remarks. I will pass on the floor directly to Emily McKenzie, who is head of evidence and policy for the economics of biodiversity independent review team, Her Majesty's Treasury. Oh yeah, by the way, today we will touch upon a broad range of various issues. We're not just going to be discussing some technical stuff and technical difficulties pertaining to forecasting and simulating environmental issues for the sake of energy sector and so on and so forth. We'll be taking a broad review. We'll be discussing sustainable development, biodiversity, a broad range of various financial and environmental issues pertaining to this very relevant topic which we all take interest in. And Emily's presentation is titled The Dasgupta Review on the Economics of Biodiversity Modeling for Nature. I personally believe that you have a unique opportunity to learn about brand new outcomes which are included into the Dasgupta Review. Emily, the floor is yours, and you have a total of 15 minutes. Go ahead. Your mic is on mute, Emily.
Thank you. And let me just start sharing my slides. So I hope you're seeing the slides now clearly, and good morning. And thank you very much to the Responsible Futures Forum for this opportunity to participate and share and speak with you today. My name is Emily McKenzie, and today I'll talk with you about the Dasgupta Review on the Economics of Biodiversity, which was published in early February of this year. I'll give you a short overview of the Dasgupta Review, and I'll cover two main areas. The first is the review's framework and key messages. I'll briefly, given this is a technical session, I'll briefly talk about its central model, its economic growth and development model, but I'll also give you that overarching view of its findings. And then I'll conclude with its recommendations. And I hope after this review, you will go to the website, download the review and read it. It is a very broad and deep and long text. The full review is about 500 pages, but there is a shorter version, an abridged version of 100 pages. And if you're really short on time, there are some headline messages of just 4 pages. So please do go to the main website afterwards and and have a read. Before I start, I also wanted to stress that I'm here and the material I'm presenting here does not represent the view of the UK government or the UK Treasury. I'm presenting here today in my role in the independent review team based at the Treasury, but an independent view supporting Professor Partha Dasgupta with an independent review. So to begin, let me context on the Dasgupta review. Many reports have already made clear the extent for the first time in 65 million years and mass decline. And this presents significant risks to our economies, our livelihoods, and our well-being. But these economic consequences are often overlooked or misunderstood, particularly among economic and finance decision makers. And this is why, to help address this, in the spring of 2019, the Chancellor of the Exchequer here in the UK commissioned this global independent review on the economics of biodiversity. It's led by Professor Partha Dasgupta, who's Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge. And at its heart, the review explores the sustainability of our engagements with nature. It's an economic framework. It provides a robust economic framework for thinking about biodiversity loss, but it's grounded in a very deep understanding of ecology and earth sciences. So how ecosystems, their processes, their functions, how they're affected by our economic activity, and in turn, how our activities depend on those same ecosystems. So let me start by outlining the review's overall framework. And at its core, the review sees biodiversity loss as an asset management problem. So first, nature is natural assets produce a flow of goods and services over time. So these services vary. We rely on nature to provide us with food, water, shelter, to regulate our climate, to maintain nutrient cycles, to control disease, amongst many and many other examples, all the way through to the less tangible things like providing us with spiritual fulfillment and opportunities for recreation. So second, biodiversity is the diversity of our natural assets. We see biodiversity as an essential characteristic of these ecosystems that makes them productive, resilient, and able to adapt to change. So just Professor Dasgupta will often give this analogy. Just as diversity within a financial portfolio reduces risk and uncertainty associated with financial returns, greater biodiversity, the diversity in nature, reduces uncertainty in our natural assets and their ability to provide these services to us. And thinking of nature as an asset means realizing we're all asset managers through our spending and our investment decisions, not only governments, but also businesses and all of us as individuals. So it may not be consciously, but every decision we make is determining this mix of different assets, produced human and natural capital. And so the review argues that we have collectively failed. Global capital accounts show the extent of this mismanagement. So this chart shows estimates from the United Nations Environment Programme. It produces an inclusive wealth report of global per capita, what we call accounting values, so the true values of these three classes of capital goods since the early 1990s. And so you can see from this graph, it shows that globally produced capital per head has doubled, and human capital per head has also increased by about 13%. But the value of the stock of our natural capital, of our nature, has declined by nearly 40%. So this shows the extent of our mismanagement of natural assets. And the review is informed by our historical experience, and it recognizes that in many ways, recent history, the last 70 years, since 1950, has in many ways been the best of times. We've prospered in unprecedented ways. Today, the average person in the world enjoys a far higher income, is less likely to live in absolute poverty, and lives significantly longer than at any time in human history. And the chart on the left here shows the exponential rise in real GDP, real gross domestic product globally. Since 1950, global economic output has increased 15-fold. And this is where comes the tension. So the ways in which we have achieved this prosperity means it has come at the expense of nature. And this means, as Professor Dasgupta lays out in the review, we have simultaneously been living in the best of times, but also the worst of times. So biodiversity is declining at a faster time than in any time in history. Current extinction rates are about 100 to 1,000 times higher than the average. And the chart on the right you're seeing shows the Living Planet Index, which tracks the abundance of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians. And you can see globally since between 1970 and 2016, this has fallen by, on average, 68%. So very dramatic falls. So the review explains, it argues that this rapid environmental degradation demonstrates what we call a demand-supply imbalance. The central part of the review's framework that explains this is called the impact equation. Said that for several decades, the impact equation has been, in mathematical terms, an inequality. So you can see that inequality at the center of the planet here on the right-hand side of this slide. It represents that our demands on nature for its services have, for some decades now, outstripped. They've been greater than its ability to supply those services in a sustainable basis. So the left-hand side of this inequality is representing human demands globally on nature. You can see if I decompose this, it's determined by three factors: the size and composition of our individual demands on nature, that's small y; the size of the number of people globally, so the size of our human population making those demands, that's capital N; and the efficiency with which humanity is converting nature's services to meet its demands and returning our waste back to nature, that's alpha. And on the right-hand side, that represents nature's supply. So nature's supply is a function of this overall stock of nature, our ecosystems, that's S, and the ability for nature to regenerate, because if left alone, nature naturally regenerates, and that's G. And this framework, this impact equation, is a very important part of the review, because it asserts, we say that it provides a condition for truly sustainable development. So that would require that we bring our demands at least down to be back in line with its supply. So turning this inequality into an equality. It's also fundamental because it provides the central framework for our recommendations, which I'll come to at the end, because each of those recommendations, a large part of them anyway, relate to how do you reduce our demands on nature and increase its supply to bring this back in balance. And the review argues it has a central grounding in thinking about risk and uncertainty. So it argues that this persistent overshoot in our demands is endangering the prosperity of not only future generations, but that's also starting to manifest itself now. We use the current COVID-19 crisis as one example of that. So we're running down our natural assets, as I showed in the previous graphs. We're losing our biodiversity, which maintains the productivity and resilience of those assets. And this is fueling significant risk and uncertainty. And this part of the framework is grounded in ecology and earth sciences, what we know about ecosystems, and how they are, and to use some jargon, non-linear. So to make that sort of easy to understand, in other words, if you're to break an ecosystem, this conglomeration of living and non-living things that interact together, if you break it apart, into smaller parts, the sum of what it's able to deliver is less than it was as a previous whole. And we in particular emphasize what this means for something called ecosystem tipping points and regime shifts. So looking at how ecosystems can shift from very diverse, productive, healthy systems to poorer, less productive systems, and how these changes can be hard to predict. They can be rapid, they can happen very fast, and they can have far-reaching consequences. And we give some examples of those both locally and globally. A powerful example is the Amazon rainforest. If it were to shift from rainforest to savanna, it could have huge impacts on the water cycle globally. So we explore the significance of this, the fact that these changes are hard to reverse, maybe impossible to recover from. And we look in particular at an economic concept of option value. So arguing that conservation, all else equal, is going to be preferable than restoring these ecosystems because it may be impossible to recover from, it may be costly to recover from, and it allows us to keep our options open. So the review also sort of looks at why are we doing this, how to understand why we're doing it in order to know how to address it, and highlights 3 pervasive features of nature that make it difficult to record our use of nature and how we're affecting it. So these features are that it's mobile, so it moves, fish swim, winds blow, nature is, as Partha would say, always on the move. It's also in many cases silent and invisible. So for example, the biodiversity, hugely complex biodiversity beneath our feet in the soils, in the ground. And these characteristics make it very difficult to account for what we're doing. And this leads to, in economic terms, pervasive externalities. So the impacts of my actions, I am not taking account of my impacts on my actions on others because of these characteristics. And this means that nature's true value for the various goods and services we all benefit from are not reflected in market prices. And these pricing distortions have led us to that first graph I showed, investing relatively less in nature and relatively more in produced capital. So we're underinvesting in our natural assets because of this. And the review sets out that this situation is unsustainable, as you can see from the impact inequality. It can't go on forever. It presents various risks, but also that it is a product of institutional failure, not only market failure, but institutional failure. In other words, our institutions that we've created have not successfully managed these externalities. So 2 examples of this. Governments in many places around the world are making these pricing problems worse by paying people to exploit, to extract from nature rather than to protect it. We give examples of extensive subsidies, for example, to fossil fuels, agriculture, fisheries. We also lack institutional arrangements globally to protect these global public goods, these ecosystems like tropical rainforests or the open ocean that we're all benefiting from. And at its heart, one of the review sort of most powerful things, I think, is starting from the understanding that our economies are embedded in nature, embedded in the biosphere, which is our global ecosystem. And the review points out how this contrasts with standard macroeconomic growth and development models. And it also shows how it has implications for what we mean by sustainable economic growth and development. So in standard economic growth and development models, humanity is seen as external to nature, sort of apart from it. And we're viewed in those mathematical models as dipping into nature for goods and services, returning our waste back to it, and being able to leave unaffected. The review argues that this is viewing this as us as external to nature has encouraged the view that human ingenuity and technology can raise our global output, our GDP indefinitely, without risking the biosphere, our ecosystems, tipping out of their stable regimes and us facing the consequences. So the review takes a different approach. In contrast, the review draws on ecology and earth sciences to show how ecosystems, our environment, are affected by our economic activity. This includes how we extract resources, how we put waste back, and how this ultimately damages ecosystems that we rely on for the services they provide. And in doing this, it argues that because the biosphere is bounded, because our planet is bounded, the global economy is bounded, and probes what this means for sustainable growth and development. And I won't go into, as we're short on time, all the technical details of the model, but if you go to the review in chapter 4 star is a technical chapter for the review, which presents this model of the global economy embedded in the biosphere. And Professor Dasgupta strongly believes that these technical models have a big impact on the policies of people in government, the decisions of international organizations and business, because they're used to forecast, and I know this is the topic of today, forecast economic trajectories, evaluate policy options, design policy. And so these economic models are very powerful because they shape our thinking of what's possible in our economies. So in this formal representation of the model, those of you who are familiar with traditional macro growth models, such as the Solo model, you'll see it has two important distinct adjustments. It has first, it has a stock supplying these regulating services, things like regulating our climate in the form of a global public good, that's S, and it includes those as a multiplicative factor, which is actually absent in nearly all contemporary economic growth models. So this captures, this S in your Solo model captures the fact that the human economy is embedded in the biosphere. Second, you can see there's a flow of extracted, what we call provisioning services. These are the things that we take out from the environment, that's R. And so what this model is showing is the tension between our extraction of those services and its ability, its damage of that stock S that's able to provide us with all these services we need for our economies to thrive. So I'll move to concluding now just with the review's recommendations. I'll give you a brief overview of them. It argues that to achieve sustainable economic growth and development, it requires us to take a different path where our engagements with nature are sustainable, and shows how this would increase our collective wealth and well-being for us and for our future generations. And it shows how we collect these into three broad transitions that need to take place. The first is to shift from that impact inequality to equality, which means increasing nature's supply and reducing our demands. The second is to change our measures of success in order to guide us onto a more sustainable path. And the third is to transform our institutions and our systems to enable this change. I'll briefly talk of each in turn, and this figure shows the main examples that we highlight, the dozen kind of recommendations we make. So the first, in the first example, to bring this impact inequality to equality, that includes actions on the supply side. So this could be restoration and conservation of nature and improving the way we manage the land and sea to benefit both nature and people, things like sustainable agriculture or sustainable fisheries. On the demand side, we look at how we can reduce our demands through managing the demographic transition, better access to community-based family planning and reproductive healthcare, and also shifting to more sustainable patterns of consumption and production. And this, we emphasize including this transparency of the impacts across entire supply chains, and also investing in technology. So although the review emphasizes technology will not answer all our problems, it shows it does have a role to play in improving the efficiency with which we engage with nature. In the second bucket of recommendations, we look at measures of success. So the review argues that while standard economic measures like GDP, gross domestic product, are indispensable for short-run macroeconomic analysis, it shows that GDP significantly misleads because it's a flow measure, not a stock measure, and it doesn't include natural capital in terms of our primary measure of economic success. Instead, the review argues that we should be using inclusive wealth, which is a measure of our total stocks of capitals, produced natural and human capital, as our primary measure of success. And we also briefly, underpinning that is the need for good natural capital accounting. And we show also that we'll need to revise our productivity measures because they also need to account for nature. Finally, our final bucket around systems change and institutions change. There's a lot in here. I'll just focus on two particular systems we highlight. The first is the finance system. So how the global financial system needs to ensure that both public and private sources of finance are reoriented to go into nature and also to manage nature-related risks. And on the second system is education. So Professor Dasgupta argues that no institution will be able to observe and verify everything we do. So ultimately, we must take responsibility for our own actions. And so it's important that we understand how we depend on nature and how it supports us in all aspects of education, through from the earliest years all the way through to in adulthood, and particularly in economics as a discipline. So I leave you here with the review's key messages. I won't reread them as we now come to the end of the session, but I look forward to taking your questions and being in conversation with the other speakers on all of these issues. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Emily, for a very interesting presentation. And you did touch upon a broad range of issues that are extremely relevant. Based on my experience, I just wanted to add a few words. Last year, I was lucky to take part in preparing a section for a Russian report on actions to comply with the Biodiversity Convention provisions. And despite the fact that we have demonstrated some progress in conserving biodiversity, there are shortcomings as well. And Russia undertook a commitment to reduce the subsidies for fossil fuel production. But actually, these figures go up all the time. And naturally, that affects in a bad way biodiversity. And Russia's expenses to preserve biodiversity, and that includes expanding the specially protected areas, are not on a par with the subsidies that go to oil and gas and other fossil fuel industries. One other thing that I totally agree with you on is the need to properly forecast economic development in Russia and elsewhere in the world. Right now, all the economic forecasts are linked with brand new models such as comprehensive or integrated assessment models. This is a mainstream approach embraced by most of the scientists and academics. And such models include not just the energy sector or other industries. In addition to that, such models include additional modules that pertain to forest ecosystems, oceans, water resources, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, in Russia, at least for the time being, we haven't seen much progress on using such models, but we do hope that such integrated models will take off in Russia. So we have established close collaboration with our UK counterparts, but we'll be looking forward to expanding our efforts on that. Once again, thank you so much, Emily, for sharing some useful information with us. And indeed, it would be quite interesting to read through the Dasgupta review. I believe that it touches upon some of the important tasks that we all face. For instance, taking account of the so-called green GDP. The Moscow State University faculty says that if we take into account the environmental damage in calculating the GDP, then the GDP growth rates would be in the negative, which means that we are exhausting the natural resources, and our impact on the nature is leads to extremely bad consequences. Our next presenter is Sheen Davis-Volim, head of School of the Built and Natural Environment, interim head of the Environmental Sustainability Research Center, University of Derby. And the title of her presentation is Embedding Sustainability and Climate Change into Curriculum and Student Research. This is another important task that we all face. And in the High School of Economics, I'm responsible for offering two curricula which are in high demand with students because the undergrads want to learn more and they want to take part in various sustainability research. Sian, the floor is all yours. You have a total of 15 minutes. Please share whatever you have to say.
Can you see my shared screen there and hear me? Thank you.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to thank Responsible Futures Forum and British Council Russia for inviting me today. It's my pleasure to talk to you. And I'm going to be talking about how we use higher education to achieve a sustainable future, a responsible future. As you've already introduced me, I am the interim lead for the Environmental Sustainability Research Centre, and I head the School of the Built and Natural Environment, and I am by training a geoscientist. So I'm going to start with a question, really. Why should we embed sustainability in curriculum and our student research opportunities? Well, we've already heard Emily speak very eloquently about the main outcomes from the Dasgupta report. We're facing increasing populations, growing consumption and resource use, continuing rise in greenhouse gases, and loss of biodiversity. And as educators in the higher education sector, we have a unique opportunity to include sustainability within our curriculum to develop a new generation of global citizens who can ensure the future of our planet and address these issues of sustainability. So I've noted here the Sustainable Development Goals. So they were designated by the United Nations in 2015 to be realised by 2030. They're a set of 17 interconnected global goals designed to secure a more sustainable future for all. And they represent really an increased urgency to take positive action for a sustainable future. And what I'd like to do with those is to talk about two frameworks that support embedding the Sustainable Development Goals and sustainable development into higher education curriculum. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we've done on that at the University of Derby. And then I'm going to talk briefly about my own research on sustainable coastlines and how I've used that as a vehicle to support students in engaging with research and learning about sustainable development. So the first of these frameworks is the UN Education for Sustainable Development. It is a toolkit for how to embed the Sustainable Development Goals within all aspects of education. It goes from primary through to university level. You'll see the quote here. It aims at developing competencies that empower individuals to reflect on their own actions, taking into account their current and future social, cultural, economic, and environmental impacts from local and global perspectives. But it's far more than that. It's a very practical guide that contains learning objectives around each of the 17 SDGs. And those learning objectives are around cognitive, socio-emotional, and behavioral aspects. And it even lists possible activities that you could embed within your curriculum. So it is a very practical resource. So in addition to the general aims and purpose, it has all of that very pragmatic approach and uses case studies from organisations in various countries that have already been successful in embedding the SDGs in their curriculum. So that's the global framework that we are using. We also have in the UK a national framework, Education for Sustainable Development, and this has been developed through the QAA, the Quality Assurance Agency, and AAAdvance HE. And that's our organisation that really sort of supports all aspects of higher education in the UK. And again, it's a toolkit, and it's for designing education relative to sustainable development. And the latest version is actually going to be launched on Monday, so very timely. So their launch is next Monday, 29th of March. So there's a real force both internationally and nationally to embed sustainability within our curriculum. But that drive is not just coming from international, national organisations and the university themselves, it's also coming from students and student expectations. And I have a quote here from the new Advanced HE Sustainable Development Guidance document that gives an idea of how the student appetite for sustainability, both within their institutional practices, but also within their curriculum. And just to cite here, in a survey the National Union of Students in the UK undertook last year in 2020, 83% of those who responded to the survey wanted to see sustainable development actively incorporated and promoted across all courses. So not just those that are obviously sustainability related. So there's a real appetite for students to see this as well. So those are the two frameworks that we can use to embed sustainable development, sustainability, and included in that aspects of climate change within our curriculum. I want to tell you a little bit now about how we're doing that at the University of Derby. And I'll talk generally about it, and then I'll talk specifically about a module, a degree that's very much related to sustainability. So this is the school that I lead, the School of Built and Natural Environment, and you can see it is very interdisciplinary. It covers a very broad range of subjects, and what we're doing, and this is work that's going on across the university, is to look at how we deliver those sustainable development goals within our curriculum. So not just curriculum that's very obviously aligned to sustainability in the environment, but across curriculum. And by embedding those sustainable development goals, I'm not just saying, well, this degree obviously adheres to goal X and Y. So for example, the zoology degree would relate to SDGs, the life on land and life on water. It really is adhering to those learning objectives and activities that are set out within the environment for the UN Education for Sustainable Development. So it's a very deep look at sustainability in different degree courses across the university. So and in this school, in our school, so we have this broad interdisciplinarity, and we also are fortunate to have the Environmental Sustainability Research Centre that can support that development of sustainability within our degree programmes. Now we have recently developed, and we are going to deliver this for the first time. We have our first set of students starting on this degree in September, a bachelor's in environmental sustainability. This is a sort of new degree, very non-traditional, not a traditional subject area at all, but we've developed it as a route for training those environmentalists of the future to deliver on the kind of things that Emily talked about in her talk. So those that can become leaders in sustainability, respond to the need for a better approach to environmental sustainability and actually work in the green economy and the green sector. And you'll see that the degree, I've given a range of the topics that are covered here, and you'll see that, again, it's very interdisciplinary. It includes aspects of earth sciences, of ecology, but also within there, I want to point out to you that there are topics, there are modules that are around the business of sustainability and managing the environment. It's very important if you are delivering this to students that they can, sorry, I've just had somebody come to the door, that they actually have that practical experience and to take out into their employability. So those management and business related skills. So they could be working in an organization and ensuring that that organization is meeting its sustainability goals. So we foresee students that graduate from this degree going out and being in that kind of sector. So basically delivering the sustainable development goals. And this is our pilot program for embedding those SDGs and delivering that education for sustainable development. Okay, so that gives you a little bit idea about what we're doing curriculum wise, so broadly, and then in this new degree that we're very excited about, and I'm happy to talk more about that in more detail later. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about my personal experience of embedding sustainability and including students in my research around sustainability. My research focuses on sustainability of coastlines, and I particularly worked in West Africa. So understanding the lived experience of coastal communities in West Africa, both in terms of climate change as felt through changes in rainfall, in rainy seasons, storminess, coastal flooding, erosion, sea level rise, increased temperatures, but also those development challenges and sustainability challenges that are very much interconnected between the physical and the human stresses. And I can talk more about that later, but this is just to give you an outline of the work, my current research. So I've been working to include students within that research to help them understand issues of sustainability and also include this within our curriculum. So I want to talk first about a program that we have at the University of Derby that allows student researchers or students to work with academic researchers. And that is, actually, sorry, I misspoke. I'm going to talk first about those interconnected challenges that are faced by our coastal communities. So in West Africa, there are issues associated with being a low-income country. So we can see you've got the climate change on one aspect of the mind map here, the issues of sanitation, waste management, population growth, environmental migration, economic migration, resource management, very much connected to those SDGs that we saw in the first slide. These are all challenges, and this is all something that we're working on in this research that embodies both social and physical scientists, and includes scientists from the UK and from West Africa. So I'll move on to talk about how we're including students within this research. So at the University of Derby, we have an undergraduate research scholarship scheme, and this allows undergraduates to work with academic researchers. It's been in place for 5 years now. It's competitive. Undergraduates have to apply to be a part of the programme, and they get a bursary to work on this over the summer. So there's a sort of economic incentive, financial incentive there. Our programme this year is focusing specifically on sustainability and global challenges. But I just wanted to outline a couple of projects that I've worked on with students. So in 2018, I had a student who used spatial analysis to look at sustainability of these low-lying coastlines and understand the physical environment. In 2019, I had a student to look at the demographics of the coastal communities, so very sort of varied focus. And then hopefully this year, we're going to have a student that's looking at analysing some meteorological data we have for the area. So this gives you a flavour of the kind of work that we have undergraduate students. This isn't postgraduate, this is undergraduate students doing. So they have a really deep understanding of sustainability, and then can take that out into their future employment. And then in terms of my own teaching, I've used this research around sustainable coastlines in modules that I've taught in environmental hazards. So thinking about sea level change, coastal flooding and erosion, around understanding climate change adaptation, mitigation, around environmental management, how we manage sustainable coastlines, and more in general about global environmental issues and an understanding of sustainability, particularly around coastlines in low-income countries. So that's a quick overview, really, about the kind of things that we can be doing to embed sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals within higher education. I've spoken a little bit about the frameworks, both the international UN framework and the framework within the UK set up through Advance HE. Something about a specific degree that's designed to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, and a little bit about my research and how I'm using that as a vehicle to get students involved with understanding and research around sustainable development, specifically around coastlines. And what I've done in my last slide is I've included some references here. So the first two references in the list here are the two documents I referred to, those two frameworks, the UN one and then the AAAdvance HE. And then the other documents are related to research around the sustainability of West African coastlines. I think I'm going to finish there. So I will stop sharing my screen. And apologies for the interruption. I did have somebody come to the door right at a very inopportune moment, and I think that's kind of reflective of how we are working at home and being on virtual calls. So apologies for that.
Thank you so much, Sian, for a very interesting presentation. Actually, I'm looking forward to getting in touch with you to discuss how do we collaborate with the University of Derby to integrate your findings into a joint curricula. But let's postpone that issue until the Q&A session. And now I'd like to pass on the floor to Igor Makarov, who is head of the School of the World Economy, head of the Laboratory for Climate Change Economics, a senior research fellow at the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies. Igor, the floor is yours, but before you start, let me state the title of your presentation. It's Global Decarbonization and its Impact on the Russian Economy. You have 15 minutes. Please stick to the time slot allocated to you. Thank you so much, Georgi. I hope you can see my PPT stack on your screen. Before I pass on to the presentation itself, let me just say a few words to follow up on what the previous speaker mentioned. I'll touch upon the way we try to integrate sustainable development goals and sustainability approach into our curricula. In addition to trying to roll out training courses at the Higher School of Economics, by the way, I lecture on the environmental protection, and Georgi has a training course on the energy transition. I'm also head of the lab for the climate change economics, which aims to engage students in various researchers. And our objective is to actually nurture the new generation of professors, early career researchers who would specialize in environment. Because a couple of years down the line, I mean, like in 5 to 7 years, these are going to be the leaders who will start rolling out all these training courses and curricula across Russia and elsewhere in the world. And indeed, the issues that we are discussing right now need studying by all the undergrads in all colleges and universities, because we are living in the world which is limited by the environmental boundaries, and we can no longer ignore them. And the very first speaker of today's session stressed that time and again in her presentation. So one of the work streams that we pursue at our lab is global decarbonization and its impact on the Russian economy. That's what my PPT stack is going to be devoted to, and I will share with you the outcomes of the research and analysis that we have carried out in a couple of past years. And we discussed that with policymakers, various stakeholders, and so on and so forth. The main approach was to develop the EPPA model. Well, actually, it was a joint project with MIT. this is a global model that allows us to calculate the balance. The economy is split into 14 sectors. 18 global regions have been singled out. Russia is a standalone region, by the way. We took into account all the trade flows as well as energy flows and waste flows. The data was acquired from the GTAP database, which is well known to all those who specialize in developing economic models. Some of the assumptions that we developed jointly with our MIT counterparts are shown in the screen, and then they pertain to the energy sector. Actually, this diagram paints a better understanding of the environmental and industrial landscape for decades to come. We use the EPPA model to forecast things to happen to the Russian economy. What if all the countries across the world comply with the greenhouse gas emissions obligations that are part of the Paris Agreement? Well, I guess it's common knowledge that Paris Agreement had a double effect. On the one hand, it wants to limit the temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade. And moreover, one of the objectives is to do our utmost to keep it at 1.5 degrees level. However, if we deep dive into specific national contributions by different states, there is such a thing as the INDC, intended nationally determined contributions. If we study them closely, we'll see that they are not sufficient to comply with the Paris Agreement provisions. Most of the countries stated their INDC through to 2030. So it would be quite interesting to better understand what if all the countries comply with their INDCs? How will it impact the Russian exports of fossil fuels and the Russian economy in general? So actually, we studied 3 different scenarios. The first scenario, which we decided to call the reference scenario, is basically business as usual. In other words, we don't do anything, we ignore the Paris Agreement, and this is the business as usual scenario. The INDC scenario shown in the middle is what we expect to happen if countries comply with their obligations undertaken in Paris. And the 2 degrees scenario is the one showing what's going to happen if, starting from 2030, countries embrace more ambitious INDCs as opposed to those that they undertook a commitment to comply with back in Paris. And well, Russia's exports of fossil fuels are shown for different scenarios. The business as usual clearly shows that the Russian exports of fossil fuels would increase. The INDC scenario also envisions a slight increase. As for the 2 degrees scenario, after 2030, Russian exports would plummet. And well, there would be a huge difference for different fossil fuels. These are the same scenarios, but for coal exports. Given the Paris Agreement, if you take any of the scenarios, such as the INDC or 2 degrees, so the 2 degrees scenario, the Russian coal exports would go down considerably, and there is basically no difference between the INDC and the 2 degrees scenario. The Paris commitments are enough to drastically reduce the coal exports from Russia. Well, there will be a more salient drop in the 2 degrees scenario, and the Russian coal exports would go down to 0 quite quickly, but even the INDC scenario will see a drastic reduction. As for the gas exports, the situation is more favorable for Russia, I would say, because, you know, gas is a cleaner fuel in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And the INDC scenario reads that the Russian gas producers will even be able to step up their gas exports at a slower rate as opposed to the business as usual, but nevertheless, the Asian markets will consume most of the gas because they will shift from coal to gas. However, the 2 degrees scenario clearly shows that even gas exports would go down significantly in absolute figures. And naturally, that will have an impact on some economic KPIs. This diagram shows the impact of lower exports on the GDP growth rates in Russia. The basic scenario is business as usual. By 2030, the GDP would grow at a rate of 2.5%, then it will go back to 2%. But what we're interested in is to calculate how much the GDP growth rates would reduce if the INDCs become tougher. The GDP will slow down by 0.3 to 0.5% per annum. And this is a significant figure, especially given the fact that the business as usual scenario envisions a GDP growth rate of 2%. So if you subtract that every year, you'll see that the economic impact is going to be huge. As for the 2 degrees scenario, after 2030, the GDP growth rate would reduce by an additional 0.3%. That means that annually Russia's GDP growth rates would go down by 0.8%, which is a significant figure, especially given the fact that the current GDP growth rates are not too high. And that just goes to show you that it's impossible to develop the economy without adapting it to the decarbonization requirements. We studied several possible options for diversifying the Russian economy. I'm not going to deep dive into them, but the essence is basically the same for all of these scenarios. Risk mitigation by 2050 and increasing the GDP growth rates for the GDP growth rates to stay on par with the business as usual scenario. But of course, the adaptation to decarbonization requirements would slow down the GDP growth rates in the near future because we would need to revise the overall infrastructure, and it'll take time. Of course, that means that for the incumbent policymakers, this is not a desirable situation, especially given the fact that they focus on short-term wins. And this chart shows what's going to happen to the Russian exports of fossil fuels to Europe, given the fact that Europe is becoming greener. Prospects for coal are very grim. As for the gas exports, if the Green Deal is complied with, then Russian gas exports to EU will go down to 0 by 2050. One other thing that we have studied is the impact on the Russian economy, not just by the fossil fuel exports, but also various customs fees imposed on carbon exports. The mechanism goes by the name of carbon border adjustment mechanism. Right now, this tool is only used in the EU, and various Russian experts calculated the possible losses if this mechanism is applied to the Russian fossil fuel exports. Estimates range from 3 billion to 50 billion US dollars per annum. These are the potential losses. Maybe these figures are slightly over-exaggerated. I guess we agree with these estimates to a greater extent. And the potential losses vary from several hundred million to just over 1 billion US dollars per annum, depending on the scenario of rolling out the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU. But the most important thing is that Russian exports are carbon intensive, and it will be subject to the carbon dues by many countries. Right now, the EU is the only supranational body that plans to roll it out, but I guess sooner or later, similar mechanisms will be rolled out elsewhere in the world. And if you compare the carbon intensity of Russian exports, you'll see that we're even way above China, not to mention the developed economies. And basically what it means is that Russian exports would experience more pressure from different angles. And we're talking about industrial product exports. This is something that could drive the Russian economy forward. I'm talking about metal exports, chemicals exports, fertilizers exports, agricultural products exports, and so on and so forth. And all of these products are carbon intensive, extremely carbon intensive, and thus the high risks. And the last thing I want to touch upon, since I'm almost out of time, is as follows. I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the carbon intensity of the Russian exports partially stems from domestic reasons, such as obsolete production facilities, the fact that we lag behind technologically developed countries, and partially it stems from the global labor division, because, you know, BRICS countries, that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, these countries export carbon-intensive products. And there are carbon-intensive product importers. Most of them are OECD member states, and that includes the UK, by the way, and the US, as well as the EU member states. If you take a closer look at the importers, Sweden is a striking example. Its emissions are extremely low. It's a green country. However, if you take a look at the emissions consumption, you'll see that it's way higher than the emissions production. So basically, the carbon footprint of an average Swede is comparable or higher than that of an average Russian citizen. So the reason for that is quite simple. Sweden does not produce carbon-intensive products, but it does import such products from abroad, including from Russia. And that poses a huge problem for everyone. The global labor division highlights the need to move the emissions curbing issue from the national level to the international level. You can hardly reduce emissions in Sweden and believe that it solves the problem. It doesn't, because Sweden keeps on importing carbon-intensive products from such countries as Russia, China, India, and so on. So that means that we should focus on the carbon-intensive exporters, and they should be the focus of our attention, because it's cheaper to go from their end. And we prepare a standalone report on that. I'm not ready to present the outcomes to you right now, but the essence of the report is going to be as follows. If you compare the developed countries and the emerging countries, such as the BRICS countries, in terms of the emissions costs, then the BRICS countries would be somewhere here. Their emission costs would be per unit would be lower than those in the US or the UK. So if we start focusing on the cheapest way to reduce emissions, then we should start with emerging economies such as Russia. And that paves additional opportunities for various joint collaborative projects and various climate change projects. Ultimately, that would benefit the economy in general, because greenhouse gas emissions projects will be implemented in Russia, and they will be cheaper than those implemented elsewhere else. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Igor, for a very interesting presentation. Thank you for touching upon some relevant issues. Let's move on to our next presenter because he's going to be talking about the very same thing. I'd like to pass on the floor to Vladimir Potashnikov, a Senior Research Fellow, Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, RANEPA for short. The title of his presentation is Deep Decarbonization Pathways, Cost Feasibility. He took part in a number of projects, including the Deep Decarbonization Pathways. And he also was one of the experts who developed provisions of the Paris Agreement, in particular Article 4.19. Vladimir, the floor is all yours. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. Well, to span the bridge from the previous presentation to my presentation, I just wanted to touch upon the major effects that impact the global demand for fossil fuels. I believe that includes replacement of fossil fuel-based electricity with solar and wind power, and according to the IRENA, which is the International Renewables Agency, new renewable capacity grew faster than that of the fossil fuel starting from 2012. Diesel and gasoline vehicles will be replaced with e-cars, and electric cars require 2 to 4 times less fossil fuels than internal combustion engines. And it's even important, more important to show that they consume gas rather than oil, and oil is the most expensive fossil fuel. And last but not least, global efforts to prevent climate change is something that we have to take into account. On the other hand, the global population grows all the time, and industrialization is another factor that we have to take into account. However, that primarily happens in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Asia-Pacific region, which are not adjacent to Russia. And the demand from the EU and China will reduce due to the aforementioned reasons. As for Russia, Russia is not very ambitious about using renewables, decarbonization, or the use of electric vehicles. Indeed, we plan to start exporting the so-called gray hydrogen starting from 2025. However, the emissions will go up until 2030, and I'm not saying that these scenarios are totally wrong. The major reason for these scenarios is the officially approved policies, including the energy sector development strategy. On the other hand, Russia is looking at a window of opportunity because it can embrace a very cheap approach to decarbonizing its economy. You might ask me, why is this happening? This is a simplified flowchart. I don't want to offend anyone. I just wanted to emphasize the decision-making process as perceived by an outsider in Russia. For instance, the Russian government has two options, either to go ahead with the decarbonization or not. If they decide not to go with the decarbonization efforts, so then we'll just subsidize the existing infrastructure, both well, for instance, the coal industry is subsidized. This is common knowledge. And yesterday, well, actually, the day before yesterday, we mentioned the fact that the oil tax taxation regime is being mitigated. For instance, oil producers get up to 60% of subsidies, and if the Russian government, for some reason, knows that there won't be any drastic changes in terms of the climate change policy, the global one, then indeed the Russian economy is going to be well off. The fossil fuel exports would increase, and the domestic demand will be the main limiting factor. If the domestic demand were lower, then we would be able to export more abroad. However, the situation is much more complicated. You know, the climate change policy might be tougher. The INDCs could be way tougher. And in that case, in this scenario, Russia is not going to be ready for the new macroeconomic environment. Non-fossil fuel exports would be difficult as well because of the import fees and import dues, because efforts are undertaken to discern between those countries that comply with the climate change requirements and those who don't. If we do not actively pursue the climate change policy, then Russia will be able to export more oil only if it upgrades the industry. But if the policy is implemented globally, then Russia will only be able to export non-fossil fuel products without additional fees. And if Russia introduces certain taxes to reduce carbon emissions, then these taxes will go to the Russian domestic budget. So if you take the overall scheme of things into consideration, then it becomes quite clear that decarbonization does not necessarily mean economic losses. On the contrary, it will result in benefits. And you know, in foreign investors, when they make a decision on investing into Russian assets or not, they actually take into account most of the things shown here. They take into account a global view. And they don't want to invest into dirty assets or non-environmentally friendly assets. And they do understand that the GDP growth rates might be high, but it's not going to be stable, and ultimately it will result in losses. Inflow of investments is limited by the overall structure of the Russian economy and the decision-making process embraced by the Russian government in terms of the climate change. I tried to sum up all of the pros and cons on this slide. There are two options. Either we go ahead with the decarbonization or not. If we do, then we'll have to fund certain programs. But on the other hand, we won't have to fund the obsolete energy industry and pay out subsidies. The mortality rates will go down. According to various estimates, the mortality rate could reduce by 150,000 people per annum. And as I mentioned, exports uncertainty would reduce. And if Russia do not go ahead with the decarbonization, then it will not be able to ensure further economic growth. The main reasons would be a lower inflow of foreign investments. It will have a negative impact. And if the global economic policy is implemented very rapidly, we won't be able to keep up. Georgi just mentioned the project I took part in. Back in 2010, we did the breakdown of the CO2 emissions. Energy-related emissions are responsible for the largest share. And the solid lines show direct emissions and the dotted lines show indirect emissions. According to our calculations, the main decarbonization source stems to improving energy efficiency, electrifying everything that we can, and decarbonizing the power generation industry. As for the main drivers, they include improving energy efficiency of buildings and industries, and we can achieve that by using advanced equipment to produce value-added products in various industries. And as for the construction industry, buildings should be made of state-of-the-art energy-efficient materials. As for the transportation sector, e-vehicles should take off. And to ensure that, we need to roll out the infrastructure and charging stations for e-vehicles, because e-vehicles themselves are not that expensive. However, the infrastructure is the main bottleneck. As for the power generation, wind and solar power are the way to go. This map shows the plane of irradiance on fixed tilted systems. Let's assume that we'll use just solar energy for power generation. Russia is not even on the map. A very similar trend is to use wind power for power generation. This is a windmill that can generate 74 gigawatts per hour, and its efficiency coefficient is 64%. This is the chart that I copied from IRENA report, and the wind and the solar costs are lower by 2020. Solar and wind power would be cheaper than any other sources such as coal, oil, or gas. In other words, if we implement all of that, then power generation would become cheaper for Russia. Some costs might be higher, but I guess the main reason is the institutional infrastructure, legislation, limiting the external competition, because up to 60 to 70% of the equipment should be. So our objective is to identify the obstacles that drive the prices up. This slide shows the deep decarbonization calculations for Russia. Of course, if we assume that the population is growing. These calculations were done back in 2018. Now I would probably revise these calculations. More wind and solar power would be clearly present, and highlighted in red is the increased emissions given the ongoing technologies. However, the current technologies are even now obsolete, and more energy efficient technologies are available. This is our estimate. I decided to simplify it for you to better understand and interpret them. We assessed the deep decarbonization project, and we took into account only two effects: a different supply-demand structure. There will be higher demand for construction products, and that would be a must to revamp the industry itself. And the demand for fossil fuels will go down. And we also took into account the productivity growth effect. And we believe that up to 40% of GDP could be an incremental increase by 2050. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Vladimir, for sharing some interesting outcomes with us. Indeed, I guess Russia could decarbonize its economy at a low cost and become part of the advanced green community. I'm going to pass on the floor to our next speaker. That is Paul Drummond, Senior Research Fellow in Energy and Climate Policy, Institute of Sustainable Resources, University College London. The title of his presentation is Electricity Decarbonization and Offshore Wind in the UK, Drivers for Success. I'm looking forward to learning what drivers for success have taken root in the UK. I know for a fact that there were some heated debates about 10 to 15 years ago on various sources of the so-called green energy. And Paul is going to share with us some interesting data on the offshore wind energy and decarbonization. Paul, you have a total of 15 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon and good morning, and thank you for the invitation to speak. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the drivers for success for decarbonisation in the power sector in the UK, with a particular focus on the development of offshore wind. So I just need to move this, there we go. So a brief background first into the UK's progress in decarbonisation. So we've been broadly pretty successful so far. So emissions, GHG emissions from the UK have reduced by about half since 1990, even as the economy grew by around 80% in real terms. Between 1990 and around 2012, there were really kind of three drivers for this. The first is a general industrial restructuring, so away from energy-intensive, carbon-intensive manufacturing, more to a service and knowledge-based economy and higher value manufacturing, coupled with increasing efficiency of that industrial production. Also, increasing energy efficiency in other end-use sectors, so particularly buildings, particularly within that domestic buildings and transport, and also what was known as the dash for gas in power generation. This is in the 1990s where the UK power market became liberalised, and the move away from an absolute dominance of coal towards a more gas-based generation profile took place. And obviously gas has a lower CO2 intensity than coal. Since 2012, though, really decarbonisation has really been almost entirely driven by decarbonisation in the power sector. And there's quite a strong trend you can see with the charts here, the dotted line. Post 2012, the trends for both power generation and CO2 emissions totally in the country followed a very similar path. So since 2012, decarbonisation in the power sector has reduced by around 2/3. So that took place in around 7 years. And that was the fastest rate of electricity decarbonisation found so far anywhere in the world. So from a technical perspective, there was really two drivers for this. And this is quite obvious really in the charts given on the right. There was a massive reduction in the use of coal in power generation, and at the same time, a massive increase in the use of renewables. So coal reduced by from around 40% of total generation in the UK in the early 2010s to around 2% in 2019. And early data suggests it went down even further in 2020 to about 1.6%. The main driver of this was policy. So in 2013, the UK introduced what was known as the carbon price floor. So this is a carbon price applied to the power sector in the UK only, with the objective of driving low carbon investment in renewable power in particular. This is applied in addition to the European Union emissions trading system, which is an EU-wide carbon price applied to the power sector and industrial sectors, which we unfortunately ended up leaving at the beginning of this year when we left the European Union. So in 2013, when the carbon price floor was applied first, it was at a rate of £9 per tonne of CO2. This increased slowly to £18 per tonne of CO2 in 2016, and it's remained at that level ever since. This had the effect of switching the economics from favouring coal to favouring gas with a lower CO2 intensity, and so reducing the total CO2 emissions. So we can see as well the 2016 increase really had quite an impact on this fuel switching. So in 2015, coal accounted for around 22% of total power generation in the UK. And by 2016, with the increased rate of the carbon price floor, this reduced to around 9%. So these prices, the carbon prices, get passed through to electricity prices, but the evidence suggests that really so far there's been a really minimal impact on domestic power bills, and energy intensive industry receives or used to receive compensation for up to 85% of the pass-through cost, and now they receive an exemption in the beginning for most of this pass-through cost. So the UK has a policy for total coal phase out by 2024, and we're well on track to achieving that. We now only have 3 power stations using coal to generate power, one of which next year will be converted to using gas, and one of which was just announced will be closed at the end of next year. And so only one will be generating by 2023, and that will be gone by 2024. So renewables over the same time increased from 7% of generation, and this was mostly hydro, a bit of biomass, to 37% by 2019. And this has likely increased last year, probably to around 40%. So the majority of the growth in renewables across this time has been in solar PV, but also particularly wind, both onshore and offshore. So by 2019, onshore and offshore wind each accounted for around 25% of total renewable generation and around 10% each of total power generation in the UK. And in 2010, they both accounted collectively together for less than 1%. So it really is quite a substantial growth in a very short amount of time. So a really remarkable success story in the UK story is the development and deployment of offshore wind. So in 2008, offshore wind cost around £170 per megawatt hour to generate electricity, well above any other option we had available, fossil fuel or otherwise. By 2023, this had reduced to around £40. So this is for wind farms coming online in 2023 that have been agreed between 2015 and 2020. So a very substantial reduction over this time. And offshore wind is now essentially subsidy free, or under the current contract arrangements may even generate active revenues to the UK Finance Ministry. So there's really 4 different reasons this cost reduction has happened. And we produced a report last year, which you can see referenced at the bottom of this slide, to explain why this happened. And these are 4 interlocking drivers. So the first is plenty of R&D. So this is R&D driven mainly by the private sector, but also supported by the public sector, as I'll come back to in a minute. And this is R&D into the whole range of issues related to the installation and operation of offshore wind. There's been substantial learning by doing. So by encouraging the actual deployment of offshore wind, the installers, the policymakers, the regulators can all learn how to do so, how to build the next wind farm much more efficiently, much cheaper. There's also been substantial economies of scale. So economies of scale, both in terms of the turbines themselves. Over the last decade, turbines have grown to be pretty colossal and are some of the biggest structures, certainly in the UK, and will be as they deploy even larger turbines over the next decade. But also economies of scale in the manufacturing and supply chain. As you build up all the supply chain around the industry, of course, you get economies of scale. But also one that's often overlooked is the reduction in financing costs. So as the finance industry gets much more used to financing renewable projects, they reduce their offer of financing costs, so the risk is reduced, both real risk and perceived risk. And for pretty capital intensive investments like wind farms, a reducing cost of finance can really have substantial impact on the total cost of generation. So these 4 interlocking drivers have all really been driven through strong, sustained and well-targeted government support from the UK government in particular. So I'm going to give a very brief overview for the story across the last decade or so about how the government has supported the development of offshore wind. So in 2008, we had what was known as the Renewable Obligation, which was introduced in 2002. This was the main subsidy mechanism for encouraging the deployment of renewables. Prior to 2008, this was technology neutral. And so most of the subsidy, which was delivered through what's known as a green tradable certificate mechanism, flowed to the technologies that were the most mature and the least cost, typically onshore wind. But in 2008, the government decided to encourage less mature technologies, particularly onshore wind, and so created what they called a banding exercise, in which onshore wind ended up receiving double the subsidy of onshore wind. So that was really the kickstart of the industry. But in the same year, they also launched the Offshore Wind Accelerator. And this was a joint initiative between the UK government and the devolved governments, so Scotland, the Scottish government in particular, and industry. And so all 9 of the leading wind turbine developers were involved, with the objective of achieving a 10% cost reduction between 2008 and 2015. So this was funded 1/3 by government, but 2/3 by industry. And in the same year, there was also what's known as the Crown Estate Round 3 leasing round. So all the seabed in the UK, up to 12 nautical miles offshore, is owned by the British Crown, the Crown Estate. And this is the 3rd round of auctioning for space to build up to 32 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity. And they also put in £80 million of co-funding to help develop the sites, gain knowledge and experience over how to do so effectively and efficiently. So these 3 mechanisms and initiatives really spurred a lot of collaboration between government, industry, supply chain, the finance sector, to really learn and gain experience to make the technology from a very immature technology to much more mature. So in 2013, the renewable obligation began to be replaced by a new subsidy mechanism called the Contracts for Difference. The Contracts for Difference is a mechanism by which a generator is given an agreed strike price. If the wholesale price for electricity remains below the strike price, the government pays the difference. If the wholesale price for power goes above the strike price, the developer pays the government the difference. So there's always a fixed price the generator receives, but it's reflexive, relevant to the wholesale price of power. So in 2014 or 15, the Contracts for Difference was coupled with an auction mechanism. So all generators submitted their bids based on a price per unit of power generated, with the lowest, successively lowest prices accepted up to a capacity cap. And this introduced a substantial element of competition between different developers where competition previously wasn't really in place. And this led to substantial cost reductions in new installations. There was also an increasing focus between 2013 and 2015 on offshore wind, where previously it was quite finely balanced between offshore wind, onshore wind and solar PV. But onshore wind and solar PV were really deprioritized based on some political issues we had in the UK, particularly NIMBYism in certain areas of the country that had quite high potential for onshore wind and PV. By 2019 and 20, the offshore wind sector deal was introduced. This was quite a wide-ranging deal, covering a few different things to essentially provide some long-term certainty for the industry. So it guaranteed Contracts for Difference auctions every 2 years to achieve at least 30 gigawatts deployments by 2030. And to give some context, that's around 3 times the current level of deployment we have in the UK for offshore wind. It's also introduced measures such as local content requirements for onshore wind and the trebling of the UK workforce, including through investment in education, to try and develop the supply chain and the industry to be an exporting industry. In December 2020, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for decarbonisation was announced. The first of these 10 points was an increase in offshore wind to 40 gigawatts, so increasing the previous targets of 30, increasing it to 40 gigawatts by 2030. And to give context again for this, that would represent around half of the current UK total power capacity. So the story really moved from a collaborative exercise around 10 years ago to build up an immature industry. When the industry had become much more mature, introducing competition, and when the industry really has got a foothold, as it has now, providing a long-term framework for its long-term deployment and integration as a major contributor to the UK power sector. So some key lessons we really found from the decarbonisation of UK power is that the change in market share in fossil fuel technology and cost reductions in low carbon technology can both happen extremely rapidly and often beyond even the most optimistic expectations. And the most commonly reported story on this is the reducing cost of solar PV around the world, as the previous speaker also talked about. The classic policy prescription of carbon pricing, whilst it is essential and needed, particularly to drive down the market share of fossil fuel technologies, it's not sufficient and it needs to be appropriately targeted to be effective. A range of government support is needed, from a clear and credible vision of what decarbonisation pathways and targets they're aiming for, and active support to develop nascent and immature technologies and industries. And once those supports have been given and the industry and technology begins to mature, much of the cost reduction seen is achieved through active learning by doing and economies of scale, which you can only generate through actively deploying these technologies. And contrary to old expectations, the aggregate costs of low carbon transitions due to these unexpectedly quick developments can be very low. So last year, the analysis for net zero in the UK, which is now in law for 2050, our Committee on Climate Change, which is the independent advisory board for the UK government, suggested that the UK is likely to generate a net benefit to GDP by achieving net zero emissions by 2050, particularly if co-benefits such as reduced air pollution are included, and even if this excludes the cost of climate change avoided or the benefits of avoiding climate change. And broadly speaking, new technologies must be pulled in with active support and the incumbents pushed out, typically with different policy instruments and different policy mixes. This can create whole new industries, but also the decline in older industries, the fossil fuel industries, needs to be effectively managed to prevent any particularly damaging distributional impacts and to ensure it can be a just transition. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul, for a very interesting presentation. Indeed, I am deeply impressed by the achievements demonstrated by the UK. We have to learn from the best, and there's much that we can learn from the UK. Lessons learned could be applicable to Russia, and we will definitely have a chance to discuss all these issues later on. And now I'd like to pass on the floor to Alexander Meskov, Professor, Director of Economic Sciences, Director of the Moscow Mining Institute, the Mises National University of Science and Technology. The title of his presentation is Global Agenda of Preserving the Natural Environment in Industrial Regions, Challenges and Threats. Indeed, industrial regions have a huge negative impact on the environment, so it would be interesting to learn how climate change policies are interlinked with the development challenges. Alexander, you have 15 minutes. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can see my PPT stack on your screen. Sorry for the presentation being in Russian. Actually, I thought that I could use the Russian version since we're all speaking Russian, most of us speaking Russian, but I guess interpreters will interpret everything. Let me go back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We know them by heart, but unfortunately, we only tend to remember environment when we talk about environmental impact on the humankind, but we tend to ignore the impact of the humankind on the ecosystems that could be located in different corners of the compass. Therefore, decarbonization issues that have already been discussed will become part and parcel of the efforts. But let me focus first on the ecosystem services produced by the nature. It goes without saying that ecosystems per se offer a number of services such as production services, regulating services, cultural services, and supporting services, and the regulating services, which account for the largest share of this pie chart, is what we get from the nature. We've been talking to each other for 2 hours, and well, none of us actually counted the number of breaths that we have taken, and no one calculated the volume of air that we inhaled and the CO2 exhaled. And of course, the biocenosis is the main mechanism that allows us to actually breathe. This is the data as of 2016, and according to the WWF, different ecosystems degraded. The reference point was the year of 1970. The degradation amounted to 68%, which is a disastrous figure. So biodiversity degrades at a very rapid pace. Unfortunately, we have to realize that when specific ecosystems disappear, or when specific species disappear, we lose a whole range of opportunities offered to us by the nature. Ecosystems generate oxygen. Ecosystems and live organisms are responsible for producing soil, clean water, minerals. In other words, everything that we need for the nature to exist in the way we know, in the form we know it. Humans can tap on the natural resources by using various technologies and so on and so forth. And of course, that sets in motion a whole chain reaction. Our university, well, and namely the School of Mining, is a national material science leader. And we deal with the fossil fuels and mineral extraction companies. And of course, they're great partners to us, but these are the least environmentally friendly industries, because, you know, the mining industry is the least environmentally friendly industry, followed by the steel making industry. Their combined impact accounts for about 50% of all the entire pollution. And this is the data that comes from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. This data dates back to 2018. As is clear from this slide, the power sector is in the red, but mining and steel are the two industries that account for the greatest part of the pollution. So both our school and our partner companies are quite interested in making their businesses greener. And as is clear from the open source data, largest Russian corporations try to go green. They try to roll out the best available, best-in-class environmental technologies. And we launched a national environment protection project recently. And the main pillars revolve around making large industrial corporations greener. We do understand that industrial companies working in various industries have to keep on working. Let's take mining and steel and mining, metals and mining. They have a huge environmental footprint. And we as researchers need to understand the impact and the main KPIs of the impact to be able to calculate the damage done. Then, jointly with scientists, biologists, those who study ecosystems, we need to identify what ecosystem aspects are affected and why. And by establishing this feedback loop, we'll be able to better understand the consequences for specific ecosystems and specific species. Only after that will we be able to better understand how to minimize the impact. And this combination of the consequences, the ecosystem researchers that need to be done will help us better understand what actions should be embraced by the industrial companies. We will probably launch international clean water programs in addition to the decarbonization programs. In other words, this is a global task, which means that we need to use big data to run researchers in different regions of the planet, especially if we focus on similar industries. Naturally, the ecosystem and species consequences could differ. They could vary from a slight damage to a total destruction of arable land, from changing fragile Arctic ecosystems or steppe ecosystems, and they're fragile because very few species live there. So we could be discussing the consequences for ages, but what I'm driving at is that the consequences should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. This slide lists criteria for selecting the right steps to preserve and conserve ecosystems. They include spatial, temporal, social, and so on and so forth. But what we need to do is identify specific criteria to assess the effectiveness of the measures taken in a specific ecosystem in a specific region. It goes without saying that for metals and mining regions, such measures should include both preventive and mitigating and restoration activities. And that envisions the relevant legal basis, international efforts, and most of the things that we've been discussing today. Decarbonization policies should be implemented all over. Sustainable development experts have been discussing decarbonization as one of the aspects that forces the industrial companies to become greener. We came up with a new master's program at our university, which is called Environmental Protection Management. We will train experts in sustainable development and environmental protection who would focus on making the now dirty and carbon footprint intensive companies greener, more environmentally friendly, and so on and so forth. And we want each and every metals and mining company to employ managers and environmental experts who would shape the agenda. And actually, our long-term partners came up to us with this initiative. They shape the demand, and they demonstrated an appetite for going ahead with implementing the environmentally friendly agenda, and they were the ones who initiated development of the master's educational course. We do know that this is a new curriculum which needs to be tested. By the way, the COVID-19 pandemic year showed to us that we can talk to each other online, and this is especially true for the academic community. I urge everyone to take a closer look at our master's program, revise it, improve it. We'll be happy to get any feedback from you. We're quite open to any type of collaboration, and the same holds true for the industrial companies whose logos you could see at the bottom of the slide. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you, Alexander. It's great that you came up with such a large-scale master's program. You are gaining steam, I guess, and you're on the verge of rolling it out at your institute. We would be quite interested in collaborating with you on that, so let's stay in touch. And I believe the same holds true for our British counterparts. I would be happy if we come up with any form of collaboration. Thank you so much. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to remind everyone that you can and you should submit your questions in the Q&A section. We are looking forward to receiving your questions in the chat box and in the Q&A section. And now I'd like to pass on the floor to Igor Bashmakov, Director General, Center for Energy Efficiency, the 21st Century. It's great to have Igor with us. The title of his presentation is "When Can Russia Become Zero Carbon? Low Carbon Social and Economic Development Scenarios." Well, Igor has been discussing these issues for many years on end. You have the floor now, Igor. Go ahead. Thank you, Georgi. First and foremost, I'd like to offer a couple of comments on things that I have heard so far. First and foremost, Mr. Makarov said that it would be cheaper to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions in Russia, and he tried to justify that. We recently analyzed situation in Kemerovo, and in Russia, energy efficient overhauls of residential buildings can reduce the heat consumption. And by the way, in Kemerovo, most of the heat plants run on coal and partially on fuel oil. In other words, the carbon intensity is extremely high. So it's 10 to 30 times cheaper than similar overhauls in the EU. So you were right in pointing out all of that. As for Paul's presentation, well, actually, I would love to see the same title, but with Russia instead of the UK in the title. But unfortunately, for the time being, it's not so. A year ago, we ran a joint workshop and we shared the outcomes of our projects. We compared the introduction of low carbon technologies and renewable technologies in different countries. And unfortunately, Russia is lagging way behind the UK. But I would love to see Russia moving in the footsteps of the UK, and thank you, Paul, for sharing that with us. As for education, much has been said about education today. Well, and curricula should not be offered to undergrads alone. Education is a much broader definition. We should educate decision makers. They need to be educated. When the climate change was discussed in the State Duma, one of the lawmakers actually thought that China was not a signatory to the Paris Agreement, which just goes to show you that we need to educate everyone, starting from undergrads and up to high-ranking politicians and lawmakers. As far as educational initiatives are concerned, I believe that lectures should not be the only way to inform our undergrads about the most relevant issues. We need to engage them in developing models, using models. We need to engage them in research projects. Low carbon transition, some people believe, is a very simple task. No, it's not. It's very complex. It's a multifaceted problem. Not everyone understands that. Some people say that nothing can be changed, nothing is possible, while others think it's just the opposite. Both categories are wrong. Before I move on to my presentation, I just wanted to mention that 2 days ago, we held a workshop. CNF 21.ru is the website that you can go to and download some interesting information that we discussed 2 days ago during the workshop. And I hope that incentivize you to carry out your researches in the future. As far as modeling is concerned, like I said, we need to engage as many undergrads as possible in developing and using the various models. The long-term nature of a model is still an outstanding question. By the way, in Russia, we don't have a single model that would give us forecasts going beyond 2050. All the forecasts that were shared with us so far were limited to 20. Well, our forecasts show that Russia is not going to become a low carbon economy by 2050, which means that will probably happen after 2050. But no one knows what the specific deadline is going to be and what prerequisites would be required for Russia to become a low carbon economy. Thus, we need to extend the forecasting horizons beyond 2050, just like, well, China says that it will become a low carbon economy not later than 2060. It might be 2050, but it might be 20. We don't have the relevant tools to answer that question yet. And a model is basically a time machine of sorts. And the major question is, how good is it? If your time machine is not good enough, then just like in the Back to the Future movie, it might take you to a wrong place. There are other movies devoted to the very similar problem as well. And oftentimes people wind up in a totally wrong time and place. So like I said, the time machine or the model in our case should be well thought through and multifaceted. And greenhouse gas emissions happen in any domain of human activities. And that means that we need a complex options to forecasting. You can either try to define the possible trajectories based on your current point, or you can do the backcasting as the main approach, which means that you know what the desired point would be, and then you try to backtrack your footsteps to better understand what steps need to be taken. While the EU and China already identified the major milestones. For instance, the EU wants to be carbon neutral by 2050, and China wants to do the same by 2060. That holds true for other countries. Some countries assume that they might become earlier than 2050. Russia, we don't have a specific deadline, so we don't use the second approach, we use the first one. As for the way all these models should look like, I already mentioned that their complexity should be good enough to take into account the main structural elements and their interrelations. A model should have an adequate aggregation level. If we're talking about the energy transition in specific industries such as construction industry, heat generation, power generation, agriculture, waste management, and so on and so forth, that brings us to the level of technologies and separate products. But if we are using high-level aggregation, high aggregation level models, then they should focus on specific tasks, and the list of such tasks is not going to be exhaustive or complete. That means that we need more complex models with a higher level of resolution. If your objective is small enough then you can use aggregation level models. If you want to deep dive into a specific industry, you should use industry scale models, and they will focus on specific products and technologies. And the third most important feature is as follows. Paul just told the drastic changes in the energy sector in the UK. So my point is that a model, a good model, should be able to assess not just slow-moving progress, but also dynamic changes. Only in that case will we be able to realize how to go ahead with the deep decarbonization. A decade ago, the UK, had a share of offshore and onshore windmills of less than 1%. Now it's more than 10%, if I recall the figures from Paul's slides correctly. So, sorry, that was 10% each, and combined, that's over 20%. In Russia, the renewables account for less than 1% of the overall energy supply. And the question is, how quickly can we boost? What are the limitations? Some people say that the limits are extremely tough and we can hardly change anything. And even the most upbeat experts are not creative enough to say what the share of the renewables in 2050 would be. We polled a couple of experts, and they said it would be 125 gigawatts. In our 1.5 degrees scenario, we use a figure of 285 gigawatts, which means that our wishful thinking goes way beyond the modest assessments by other experts. Anyway, it could be one of the obstacles when you assess the realistic goals. And we have to be clear on what policies might drive the changes forward. A model is just a technical tool. If you change a set of variables for a different set of variables, then your outcome is going to be this or that. But the question is, what do we do in practice to change the set of variables? That would require the relevant policies and legislations. Our initial plans envisioned a share of renewables of over 4.5%. Now it's less than 1%. We wanted to decrease the energy consumption by 40%. We managed to do that only by 16%. So we failed to achieve these results. And the question is why? It's one of the most important analyses that we should carry out. And another question is what tools and what mechanisms should we use and what limitations do they have? Pyotr Bobolyov at a workshop 2 days ago stated that it's a must to take into account economic availability of energy to the end users as a limitation. And Paul and I discussed these limitations for quite some time, and we analyzed them at length. There are limitations like that, and you have to be clear on the fact that you cannot increase the carbon floor price overnight considerably, because that will slow down the economic growth rates, because the energy availability would be negatively affected. Everything should happen gradually. The carbon prices should be changed slow enough to the end users to be able to adapt. Otherwise, you will just undermine all the efforts. One other thing to mention, we excluded greenhouse gases from most of our models. Thus, it's important to understand what the feedback loops are between and what are the interlinks between the different components. Let me give you a very simple example. If the consumption of oil and gas goes down, and if the coal consumption goes down, coal and oil and gas account for 50% of the railway traffic in Russia. And that means if you transport less oil and gas and less coal, then the demand for railway traffic will go down. That means less demand for the materials used to manufacture the railway cars and tanks. And if you speed up the development of the renewables, the windmill metal intensity is higher than that of a traditional energy sector. You have to take this into account. If we switch over to public transportation, that means that the number of privately owned vehicles will go down, and a vehicle is 2.5 tons of metal. That means less consumption of metal. There is an impact on the metals and mining industry. And all of these interrelations should be taken into account by an economic model. The most recent historical data should be the basis of any assessments. The EAMS database uses the data that dates back to 2010 or 2015. Well, it's high time we start using data for 2019 or even better for 2020. Your model might be good, but if you are using obsolete historical data, then the outcomes might be totally inadequate. One other thing I touch upon, and which is, and this is something which is often omitted by the modeling experts. The seven matrices method was proposed by me way back when most of you were not even born. And the essence of this method is as follows. We do some calculations, we base our calculations on certain assumptions, and these assumptions should be converted into exogenous variables. Then we do the model calculations, you get endogenic variables set, and oftentimes experts stop at that. You get the dynamics of one parameter and of another parameter, and this is it. But this is just the beginning of the story, it's not the end of it. If you see that certain economic or climatic parameters change in a specific country, you have to deep dive and better understand what changes would it lead to in a specific country, and how seriously the economy, the political situation, and the environment of this specific country would change in a global scale. There are different stakeholders involved. There are companies that produce fossil fuels. Of course, they are not happy to see that the role of the fossil fuels will reduce in the economy. Of course, they will resist all these processes. There are green energy producers, and of course, they are strong advocates of the Green Deal. But the question is, how will these two forces balance each other out? If Russia's INDCs are not ambitious enough while other countries commit to become zero carbon economies, and if they roll out CBAM, which was mentioned by Igor Makarov and Vladimir Potashnikov, this is a totally different can of worms. Depending on the resulting external and internal vectors, we embrace domestic policies and international policies. Ultimately, what it leads to is that we have a matrix for political decision-making. However, we should be able to assess the consequences of our analytical efforts and compare it with the real data. Oftentimes, we assume that the economy will grow at a rate of 3% per annum. Then we go down this flow chart and we see that the oil and gas demand as well as coal demand would go down in all the countries, and that means that we won't be able to export these raw materials, these commodities anywhere else, and that means that the GDP growth rates will never be 3%. This is just one of the examples, and basically it would take a very complex and integrated research. This is something that economists and other experts should study to compare the results. If there is a mismatch, then the practical likelihood is extremely low, or actually this scenario would be impossible. The cone of uncertainty, which people usually draw to demonstrate that the longer term the forecasts are, the higher the uncertainty. Well, oftentimes it's not even a cone. It could be a sinus curve or any other geometrical figure, but it might not be a cone. So you have to move on and move on beyond the outcomes of the simulation. In addition to that, you have to be clear on what assumptions you include in your model to better understand how to interpret the outcomes. The National Economy Forecasts Institute published the so-called aggressive scenario. Alexander Shirov and I discussed this at length 2 days ago, and I studied the publication very attentively, and they assume that the gas and the oil and gas exports would go down by 90%, and the GDP rates will go down. But that's not because we are aggressive. That's because the entire world is gonna pursue this aggressive policy. And given the GDP reductions that they plan, they expect a reduction of 1.8% to happen just due to this factor. Judging by their calculations, this factor will not considerably slow down GDP growth rates. And if you take a closer look at the table that they developed, you'll see that a transition to the renewables will actually speed up the GDP growth rates. So like I said, you have to be careful about your assumptions. And the aggressive scenario will primarily be caused by external forces that drive forward transition to the low carbon technologies. Another problem that we all face is that when we do calculations to accommodate various governmental strategies, is that we should use the official estimates for the future growth rates. Of course, official figures are always over optimistic. Which is and the reasons are quite clear for that, because you can hardly expect the Ministry of Economic Development to be pessimistic about the growth rates. This chart shows two different scenarios, the basic one and the pessimistic one, but they actually don't differ much, which means that we need to come up with new drivers that would ensure further economic growth. Low carbon transition might slow down GDP growth rates, some experts say. However, you have to prove it. And I would say that it would be difficult to prove that we can achieve high GDP growth rates given the obsolete economic approaches. Some assumptions are extremely primitive and they do not show the actual development rates of the economy. Capital intensity is another parameter that we should use in addition to the one shown in this slide. And in several federal districts, we carried out a number of pilot projects for Rosatom. and we demonstrated that the accumulation rates increased while the GDP rates went down. We need to focus on intensive ways to develop our economy. We need to increase the AAGR. Therefore, if we assume certain economic growth rates in our calculations, we tend to use the upper curves. However, if you take a closer look at the international forecasts of the Russian GDP, you'll see that there are very pessimistic scenarios as well, but none of them are more optimistic than the ones that we use in our calculations, and that affects the calculations dramatically. The main idea is that we won't be able to create another red economy, which is not sustainable. You can develop a small-scale dirty economy, but you can no longer create large-scale dirty economy, which means that this is the only way forward. Igor, one more minute left. I'm almost done. So anyway, when we use models, and there is a whole bunch of them available to us, they span different industries, and this is the set of models that we use in our calculations. I'm gonna skip all of these slides because I'm really short of time, but I just wanted to demonstrate to you that significant changes might calculated depending on the scenarios and the assumptions, as well as the industry that you decide to focus on. For that's the energy sector, production industries, less salient, more salient changes, transportation industry, and so on. And is scenarios. For us to better understand which way to go, well, in 2014, we benchmarked different models given the same assumptions. And these are the outcomes of our comparison. We compared a total of 30 different scenarios developed by 5 different models. When we collated them, when we compared the prerequisites and assumptions, we a huge difference. And of course, such models, the outcomes of such models should be accurate enough for decision makers to be confident of the data for decision. Sometimes you have to clarify things, sometimes you have to take into account additional features and specifics. The point is that those who use the outcomes of your modeling don't understand how the models work. And the confidence level for them is key. In conclusion, I just want to mention that the work similar to ours is done by IPCC on a constant basis. In Russia, this was the first pilot project, but such simulations are important for the policymakers and makers to be confident that we can embrace low carbon development pathways, not at the expense of the economy. We have to be adaptive, we have to be more aggressive or less aggressive in certain industries, and lawmakers should see a consensus from the academic community. However, we do know for a fact that we'll never be able to reach a consensus because of the difference of opinion. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Igor, for a very, ladies and gentlemen. In the Q&A section, we have a couple of questions from Nelly Rahimova and other participants. Well, most of the participants ask whether your PPT text will be made available to them. As far as I understand, this session was recorded and it will be uploaded to the website. You will get a hyperlink, so I guess you'll also be able to download the PPT text or just well, the same question to I'd like to address it to all the speakers. Let me rephrase Ms. Rahimova's question and address it to you. Given the information that you shared with us today, do you think all of these ideas would be applied by the decision makers? Let's take Dasgupta review on biodiversity as an example. Will it be taken into account by yeah, the same question goes to all of the other presenters. Can we expect the MPs, decision makers, and well, high-ranking public officials to take our work into account? Let's go in the same order as you presented. Emily McKinsey, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Georgi. So yes, the Dasgupta review is an independent review, as I emphasized in my talks by the Chancellor and the Treasury, which is the UK's Economic and Finance Ministry, but it was led independently. So the government is now examining the review's findings and will be responding in due course. 2021, this year, is obviously a critical year for nature, with both COP15 coming up for the COP26, where nature and nature-based solutions will be a strong theme for climate change. And the UK is also president of the G7 this year. So as co-host of COP26 and president, the UK high on the global agenda. And also drawing on the intellectual basis of the review, us to do the same. So I think that the government response will come out in due course, and that will be a great chance to see how it chooses to put this into action.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Shilan, what's your take on that?
Well, what I spoke on was a little different in that it wasn't necessarily related to government policy. I talked about two frameworks, and they're there to be implemented. The UN one is international, and there are examples within the documentation, the Educating for Sustainable Development document, where SDGs have been implemented in curriculum, in higher education, but also in primary and secondary education. In terms of the UK, the fact that the QAA has updated and is about to launch its own document on how to integrate sustainability into degrees shows a real sort of appetite for that to happen, and a framework to do that. So then it remains within the gift of specific universities to how they engage with that and how they use their resources to support a sustainable education. I think that probably sums up what I want to say.
Thank you so much. Igor Bashmakov mentioned that we should educate not just students, not just undergrads, but also decision makers. We should educate them as well. Well, we could go through their kids who are currently undergrads. Igor Makarov, what's your take on that? Thank you so much. I actually share Igor Bashmakov's view, and he demonstrated a great matrix. And actually, he demonstrated the way most of the decisions are taken in Russia. the decision-making matrix is not just about the outcomes of a model, it's more about the perception of these outcomes. That's both subjective and objective opinions that we have to take into account. Well, we can share the outcomes of our researches with policymakers, and we are trying to drive the main message home. And oftentimes we have to give them simplified explanations. The very first time when we published the outcomes of our project, we actually titled it The Impact of the Paris Agreement on the Russian Economy. And actually, I had several conversations with people from different ministries and agencies. They probably didn't read the text. They just saw the title, and their main conclusion was that Russia should not sign the Paris Agreement. Otherwise, the economy would be totally undermined. And oftentimes, we have to explain to them even the simplest things. Sometimes we have to emphasize the conclusions, the very same conclusions time and again. But even if they agree with the conclusions, that doesn't mean that they will be guided in their practical steps and in their decision making by our conclusions, because there are lots of stakeholders with their own interests, and there are competing views on the same topic, and oftentimes the ultimate decision might be good for the short-term economic development, but might not be good for the long-term economic development. Oftentimes, interests of specific industries come first and supersede the interest of the national economy. And I don't think that this is the problem for Russia alone. I believe that the same approaches are used elsewhere in the world. But in Russia, there are industries that could be negatively affected by the decarbonization, and they are important for the economic development. They're major employers, and of course, lawmakers take into account their interests. Thank you so much. Indeed, planning horizons and forecasting horizons could differ. Vladimir, what do you think about this issue? You work for a large agency, for a large university, and you talk to decision makers all the time, and you have every chance to educate them. Well, I believe that most of the decision makers believe that if you just ignore the problem, it will go away. This is their main approach. And well, in our university, we have lots of smart people who should be pundits on that, but most of the decision makers, for some reason, are being pessimistic about decarbonization and policies around the decarbonization. So my forecast is not gonna seem to be optimistic to you. I don't expect any positive attitude from the decision makers. Thank you for that. Well, but we have some upbeat scenarios. Paul, you shared with us the British success story. It worked in your case. Decision makers heard your opinion and they listened to the scientists. You have 1 minute to state your views.
Yeah, so it worked very well for UK offshore wind, but I think that was largely because the decisions around it were taken outside of the traditional way of making policy in the UK. So the UK policy is quite tightly bound by a cost-benefit analysis framework, which really doesn't take into account the effects of nonlinear transformational change to a new equilibrium, which can happen very quickly. And the machinery in government simply isn't set up to account for that. So most policies, so the classic failure we have in the UK is around developing low carbon heat. And because the policies that try and develop that technology and that industry get caught up in a cost benefit analysis that assumes that these technologies are very expensive, there's several hurdles to doing it, it simply doesn't happen. Whereas offshore wind was, from a very particular time, was a strong political drive that went around these quite formalized assessments processes, which is why it ended up being implemented and being successful. But I'm optimistic that these more transformational ways of thinking will pervade government thinking much more in the future, as we see the evidence for it happening, such as in the offshore wind in the UK case, but also solar PV and other technologies and industries.
Thank you so much, Paul. And that's a great optimistic note that we should probably end on, but I still want to give the floor to Alexander Maskov. Alexandra, you had a very complex presentation to deliver, and you are quite pessimistic, but do you expect any good things looking forward? You have 1 minute. Oh, unfortunately, Alexander Maskov is no longer online. Well, anyway, Igor, in that case, you have 1 minute to add, if you want to add anything. Well, I have more than 30 years of experience of talking to decision makers. Sometimes they show interest in what you do, sometimes they don't. You have to establish a constant dialogue with them. One of the negative aspects is that the turnover is too high and public officials change all the time. You just manage to explain your views to a specific public official, and then he gets replaced and you have to start all over again from the scratch. Well, you have to be clear that nothing happens overnight. Lenin published the Iskra newspaper for 2 decades before actually the October Revolution took place. It took him 2 decades to explain to people what he wanted. So what I'm saying is that nothing happens overnight. And that means that we need to establish closer dialogue with the decision makers. Modeling experts oftentimes limit their activities to modeling the outcomes, and this is not the right way forward. We need to include sociologists and economists in this work. We need to understand the interests of stakeholders. Economic interests are what is what drives people forward, and you have to understand that people are not going to jeopardize their own economic interests for the sake of future benefits. Well, just keep this in mind. And one last thing I just wanted to touch upon is the necessity to engage in a dialogue. There is the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, and this is a great forum because once a month experts discuss the work streams and the ideas that could be relevant for upgrading the European ETS, the CBAM mechanism. People state various views, they try to explain their views, they disagree with each other, they agree with each other, but ultimately they find a common denominator, which means that we engage the expert community, the decision makers. We cannot be narrow-minded. We have to be extremely wide open-minded. Well, actually, I was sad to listen to Vladimir Potashnikov because he said that he's no longer optimistic. I am an optimist. I've been out there in this domain since 1992, and despite all of the things, I'm still upbeat. I do understand that we're going uphill. Well, all the pessimists in Russia just produce oil and gas, and all the optimists, on the other hand, focus on low-cost pessimists won't be able to do that. Only only the optimists will be able to survive in this domain. Thank you so much. And well, on this upbeat note, I'd like to wrap up today's forum. I'd like to thank all the presenters once again, as well as all the participants. I'd like to remind everyone that we're going to send you a hyperlink to a very short feedback form. Please fill it in. Your feedback is important for us to be able to improve upcoming forums. Have a nice day. Thank you so much. And have a nice so much and see you. Stay optimistic.